Part 1. The Open Road. I'd always dreamed of riding my motorcycle across the rugged backroads of Mexico. Alone, free, no destination in mind. The endless highways, the barren deserts, the winding roads through the mountains. It felt like the perfect escape. I'd been through a rough few months back in the States, and this trip was supposed to be my chance to clear my head. A solo ride through the wild, open spaces of a country I'd barely explored. It was just me, my bike, and the endless road ahead. The first few days were perfect. The air was warm and dry, the skies clear, and the road stretched out like a black ribbon cutting through a landscape of cacti and crumbling hillsides. I had my route mapped out, avoiding the tourist-heavy spots, sticking to the smaller towns and villages where I could feel the real pulse of Mexico. My only companion was the hum of the engine beneath me and the occasional rattle of loose gravel under my tires. I stopped in small villages to fuel up, grab a bite to eat, and chat with the locals. Most of them were friendly enough, though I noticed something strange after my third or fourth stop. Whenever I mentioned my plan to head further south, their smiles would fade. Their eyes would darken, and they'd lower their voices, warning me to stick to the main roads, avoid certain areas, especially as I got deeper into the mountains. At first, I didn't pay much attention. I figured it was just the usual concerns about cartels or bandits, but I wasn't worried. I'd ridden through sketchy places before, and I knew how to handle myself. I had my knife strapped to my belt and enough survival gear to last me a week if things got bad. But as the miles rolled on, the warnings began to gnaw at me. Locals muttered about strange disappearances, mysterious ruins hidden in the mountains, places where the road itself seemed cursed. I laughed it off at first. Urban legends, right? But the farther I rode, the more persistent the warnings became. On the fifth day, I reached a small, dusty town called San Emilio, perched on the edge of the Sierra Madre Mountains. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the narrow streets as I pulled up to a crumbling motel. I parked my bike outside and walked into the dimly lit lobby. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and tobacco, and the man behind the counter, an elderly guy with leathery skin and a piercing gaze, watched me closely as I checked in. "You're alone?" he asked in a low voice, as if he already knew the answer. "Yeah," I replied, tossing my helmet on the counter. "Just passing through. I'll be heading up into the mountains tomorrow." His expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes, something like fear. He handed me the key without another word, but before I could turn to leave, he spoke again. "Don't ride the mountain roads after dark," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And if you see anyone, anything, on the road that doesn't seem right, just keep riding. Don't stop." I stared at him, caught off guard by the sudden change in his tone. "What do you mean by, doesn't seem right?" He didn't answer, just shook his head and looked away, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I took the key and left, a knot forming in my stomach. I wasn't easily rattled, but something about the old man's warning stuck with me. The road ahead was supposed to be the highlight of the trip, miles of twisting mountain passes, breathtaking views, and the kind of solitude I'd been craving for months. But now, as I lay in the dingy motel room that night, staring at the ceiling fan spinning lazily above me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. It was just the locals with their superstitions and ghost stories. I'd heard the same kind of thing on other rides in remote places. But still, sleep didn't come easy that night. I tossed and turned, the old man's words echoing in my mind. "Don't stop. Keep riding." Part 2, the first signs. Morning came, and I hit the road early, determined to shake off the unease from the night before. The sky was clear, a bright blue expanse stretching over the horizon, and the road ahead climbed into the mountains, a twisting, narrow path that snaked through rocky cliffs and dense forests. I felt the familiar thrill of the ride, the hum of the engine beneath me, the wind whipping past my face. Whatever the old man had said, it was just paranoia. This was my escape, my freedom. The first hour was everything I'd hoped for. The views were stunning, the road smooth, and there wasn't another soul in sight. It was just me and the mountains. But as the road climbed higher, the landscape began to change. The trees grew denser, their twisted branches clawing at the sky, and the air grew colder, sharper. There was a stillness here that felt unnatural, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I pushed on, but that knot in my stomach started to tighten again. The farther I rode, the more isolated I felt. The road was empty, too empty. No cars, no signs of life. Not even the occasional roadside shack or wandering stray dog. Just endless curves of asphalt winding through the mountains, each turn feeling more and more like I was being led somewhere I shouldn't go. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a figure, just a shadow standing at the edge of the road, almost hidden by the trees. I slowed down instinctively, squinting against the sunlight as my bike coasted to a stop. The shadow didn't move. It was too far off to make out clearly, but something about its shape, it didn't look right. It was tall, too tall, its outline jagged and wrong, as if it didn't belong in this world. I hesitated, the old man's warning suddenly rushing back to me. Don't stop. But I had already stopped. I revved the engine, shaking off the creeping dread. It was probably just a tree, my mind playing tricks on me. The isolation, the weird vibes from the town, they were all making me jumpy. I'd ridden through foggy mountain roads before, and strange shapes could easily be mistaken for something more sinister. I pulled away, leaving the figure, or whatever it was, behind me, but my nerves were on edge now. I couldn't stop glancing at the rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me. Every turn in the road felt like it was leading me deeper into something I couldn't understand, something dark and old. The road wound tighter, the cliff steeper, and the sky above seemed to darken, even though the sun was still high. I passed a few abandoned buildings, old, crumbling houses with shattered windows and roofs half caved in. They looked like they'd been there for decades, maybe longer, forgotten by time. I considered stopping to take a look, but something about the way they leaned into the mountainside, half buried in the earth, sent a shiver down my spine. I kept riding. The next few hours were uneventful, but that sense of isolation, of something watching me from just beyond the trees, never left. The sun started to sink lower, casting long shadows across the road, and I knew I needed to find somewhere to camp soon. The last thing I wanted was to be stuck on these mountain roads after dark. I finally spotted a small clearing off the road, just wide enough to park my bike and set up my tent. The forest around me was eerily silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the faint creaking of trees swaying in the wind. I unpacked quickly, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me since the moment I'd left San Emilio. I told myself it was just the solitude getting to me. After all, this was what I'd wanted, wasn't it? As the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat by the small fire I'd managed to build, staring out into the darkening forest. I couldn't help but think about that shadow by the road, the way it had just stood there. I hadn't seen anything like it since, but the image was burned into my mind. The fire crackled softly, but the silence around me felt oppressive. It was too quiet. My mind began playing tricks on me, hearing whispers in the wind, the crunch of footsteps just out of sight. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something standing at the edge of the trees. And then, as the last of the light faded, I saw something flicker in the distance. It was faint, just a soft glow coming from deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it might be another camper, maybe someone else who'd chosen this remote spot for the night. But as I stared at it, the glow began to pulse, almost like a heartbeat. It wasn't the warm flicker of firelight. It was cold, blue, unnatural. I stood up, my heart racing. Something about that light felt wrong. Every instinct told me to stay by the fire, to ignore it, but my feet started moving before I could stop them. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and slowly made my way toward the light, the trees closing in around me. As I approached, the glow became more intense, and the air grew colder. The forest felt thicker here, the branches tangled like webs overhead, and the ground beneath my feet was soft, almost spongy, as if something was rotting just beneath the surface. I pushed forward, my breath visible in the chill air, and then I saw it, what had been casting the light. It wasn't a campfire. It wasn't anything natural. It was a doorway, standing alone in the middle of the woods, made of stone and covered in symbols I didn't recognize, glowing with that cold, blue light. I took a step back, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing, but no explanation came. There was no building, no structure, just the door standing upright, as if it had been pulled from another world and dropped here. And then the whispering started again, louder this time, and I knew I wasn't alone. Part 3, the doorway. I stood there, frozen, my flashlight beam trembling as it flickered over the stone doorway. The blue light pulsed steadily from the strange symbols etched into its surface, casting eerie shadows across the trees. It didn't belong here, not in this forest, not anywhere I knew. My mind raced, trying to piece together what I was seeing, trying to explain it, but nothing made sense. And then the whispers grew louder. They weren't coming from the trees or the wind. They were coming from the door itself, like voices trapped just beyond the threshold. Too distant to understand but urgent, like they were calling to me, urging me closer. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct I had told me to turn around, to run back to my camp and get the hell out of there. But something was holding me in place. Curiosity, fear, or maybe it was the door itself, pulling me in with that rhythmic, hypnotic light. Whatever it was, I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the strange symbols that seemed to shimmer and shift, as if they were alive. I reached out, my hand moving on its own, and ran my fingers over the stone. It was cold, unnaturally so, and as soon as my skin touched it, the whispers stopped. Silence fell over the forest, thick and heavy, as if the world itself had been put on pause. And then the door opened. I didn't see it move, but I felt it. A sudden rush of air hit me, cold and stale, like it had been trapped for centuries behind that stone. The blue light faded, and beyond the threshold, there was only darkness, an inky blackness that seemed to stretch on forever. I took a step forward, drawn to the void, my mind screaming at me to stop, but my body disobeying. I shined my flashlight into the doorway, but the beam was swallowed by the darkness, disappearing as if it had never existed. That was enough to snap me out of whatever trance I had been in. I took a shaky step back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know what this was, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. Just as I turned to leave, I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, echoing from deep within the darkness. "Help me." I stopped, every muscle in my body tensing. The voice sounded human, desperate, like someone was trapped behind the door, lost in whatever nightmare lay beyond that threshold. But how could anyone be back there? There was no building, no structure, nothing but the empty forest. "Please help me." The voice was clearer now, closer, and though I couldn't make out who it belonged to, something about it felt familiar, like I should know who was calling to me. Against every ounce of reason, I took a step closer to the door, peering into the darkness. My heart was racing, and the cold air made my breath visible in the dim light. I called out, my voice shaking. "Who's there?" Silence. For a moment, the only sound was the rapid thumping of my heartbeat, echoing in my ears. I waited, straining to hear anything, any movement, any reply, but there was nothing. And then, without warning, the voice came again, louder, more desperate. "You have to help me, before it finds you." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I glanced back at the trees, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but the forest was empty. Whatever they were warning me about, it wasn't out there. It was in the door. I stepped back, my mind racing. Whoever was on the other side, they weren't alone. Something else was in there, something they were afraid of. My instinct was to run, to get as far away from this place as possible, but I couldn't just leave them. Could I? What if it was a person, someone who had gotten lost, someone who needed my help? But no, this wasn't natural. Nothing about this was right. I turned to leave, forcing my legs to move, but just as I did, the ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, catching myself on a nearby tree, and looked down. The soft, Spongy earth I had walked on earlier was different now, darker, almost wet. And then, with growing horror, I realized why. The ground was covered in footprints. Not just any footprints, bare footprints, human, leading in and out of the door. Dozens of them, crisscrossing the clearing, pressed deep into the soil. They were fresh, too fresh. My stomach churned as I looked closer. Some of the prints were leading into the door, but none were leading back out. That's when I knew. Whoever or whatever had gone through that door had never come back. I backed away, panic setting in. I needed to get out of there, but it was too late. The ground beneath me gave way with a sickening lurch, and before I could react, I was falling into the darkness beyond the door. The last thing I saw before the blackness swallowed me was the twisted, ancient trees looming overhead, their branches stretching toward the sky like skeletal hands, as if they were reaching out to pull me under. And then I was gone. Part 4, The Descent. I fell into the darkness for what felt like an eternity. The cold air rushed past me, the black void swallowing every sound, every trace of the world above. There was no end, no bottom, just the sensation of being pulled deeper into the unknown. My heart pounded, adrenaline surging through me, but I was powerless to stop the fall. And then, with a bone-jarring impact, I hit the ground. The wind was knocked out of me, and for a few moments, all I could do was lie there, gasping for breath, every nerve in my body screaming in pain. I had no idea how far I had fallen, but somehow, nothing seemed broken. My flashlight had been knocked from my hand, its beam flickering weakly a few feet away, casting faint, shaky light over the ground. I sat up, wincing as a sharp pain shot through my ribs, and looked around. I was in some kind of cave, rough stone walls rising up on all sides, jagged and wet, dripping with moisture. The air down here was heavy, stale, and carried a faint metallic scent that sent a shiver through me. The cave stretched on ahead, disappearing into darkness, while behind me, the tunnel that had brought me down was now nothing more than a smooth, impenetrable ceiling of rock. There was no way back. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. How had I ended up here? What was this place? The door in the forest had been wrong, unnatural, and now I was trapped, far beneath the surface, in a place that shouldn't exist. I picked up my flashlight, my hands trembling as the beam flickered weakly, barely piercing the oppressive darkness. And then I heard it, a soft, distant whisper, the same voice that had called to me from beyond the door. "Help me." It was faint, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. It echoed off the cave walls, sending a chill down my spine. Whoever or whatever was down here, they were still alive. Or at least they sounded alive. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. I had no other choice. I had to keep moving, had to find whoever was calling to me and figure out how to get out of this nightmare. The alternative, staying down here, alone in the dark, waiting for something to find me, was unthinkable. I aimed the flickering beam of the flashlight ahead and started walking, each step echoing eerily through the cave. The ground was uneven, covered in slick moss and strange, twisted roots that seemed to snake up from the earth itself. Every now and then, the floor would slope steeply, and I had to catch myself on the rough stone walls to keep from slipping. The deeper I went, the more the walls around me began to change. At first, they were rough and natural, like any cave might be, but soon, I noticed carvings etched into the stone. Strange, intricate patterns that spiraled and twisted, forming shapes that made my head spin if I looked at them too long. They weren't like anything I'd ever seen before, ancient, almost alien in design, as if they were made by something that didn't belong in this world. As I continued, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. "This way, hurry." The voice sounded closer now, and it wasn't just one voice. There were others, faint, overlapping, calling from all directions. I felt a surge of dread rise in my chest. The way the voices echoed off the walls made it impossible to tell where they were coming from. But I couldn't stop. Something was drawing me deeper, pulling me toward whatever waited at the end of this path. After what felt like hours of walking, the cave opened into a large chamber. The ceiling arched high above me, vanishing into darkness, and the floor was uneven, scattered with debris. Broken stones, old bones, and something else, something worse. At the center of the chamber stood a massive stone altar, covered in dried blood and littered with bones, human bones. Some were old, cracked, and yellowed with age, but others looked fresh. Too fresh. My stomach turned, bile rising in my throat, but before I could react, I heard the sound. A soft, rhythmic breathing, coming from the other side of the altar. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The beam of my flashlight trembled as I slowly raised it, aiming it toward the source of the sound. And then I saw her, a woman, hunched over, her back to me, sitting on the ground next to the altar. Her clothes were torn and filthy, her long hair matted and hanging in tangled strands over her face. She was breathing heavily, her shoulders rising and falling in ragged gasps, as if she had been running for days. I swallowed, forcing myself to speak. Are you okay?" She didn't respond. I took a cautious step closer, my flashlight shaking as I kept the beam trained on her. "Hey, I heard you calling. Are you hurt?" Still nothing. Her breathing remained heavy, labored, as if she hadn't even heard me. I stepped around the altar, closer now, and that's when I saw it, the truth. Her legs were gone, or rather, they had been taken. The stumps where they had been were wrapped in crude bandages, soaked through with dark, congealed blood. My breath caught in my throat, and I nearly dropped the flashlight, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. She turned then, slowly, her face twisting toward me in the dim light. Her eyes were wide, sunken, and empty, as if she had seen horrors far beyond what any human could endure. Her mouth opened, and she spoke in a raspy, broken voice. "You shouldn't have come here." Before I could react, a sound, a deep, guttural growl, rose from the shadows at the far end of the chamber. Something was moving in the dark. Something big. I stumbled back, the flashlight beam jerking wildly across the stone walls, and that's when I saw it. A massive shape, hunched and grotesque, its limbs too long, its body twisted and wrong, lumbering toward me from the shadows. The woman reached out, her bony fingers clutching the air between us. "Run," she whispered. "It's too late for me, but you still have a chance. Run." And then it charged. Part 5, The Chase. The growl echoed through the cavern, deep and primal, shaking me to my core. The massive figure in the shadows began to lurch forward, its grotesque limbs moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm, like a predator that hadn't used its legs in years. I could see its hunched back, covered in matted fur, its twisted hands dragging along the stone floor as it moved toward me. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I spun on my heel, nearly slipping on the slick floor, and bolted for the tunnel I had just come from. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline surging through me as I raced back the way I'd come, the woman's final words still ringing in my ears. "Run!" Behind me, I heard the creature's heavy footsteps, loud, uneven, but fast. Too fast. The sound of its claws scraping against the stone walls echoed through the cavern, and I knew it was gaining on me. I tore through the narrow passage, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the beam of my flashlight bouncing erratically as I ran. The carvings on the walls seemed to blur together, spiraling and twisting in ways that made my head spin, but I couldn't afford to stop. I had to get out. I had to find a way back to the surface. The tunnel twisted and turned, and I barely had time to think before the ground suddenly dropped away beneath me. I stumbled, catching myself just before falling into a steep slope that descended into another chamber. I slid down, my hands scraping against the sharp rocks as I tried to slow my descent, but there was no stopping. I hit the ground hard at the bottom, rolling to a stop in a shallow pool of stagnant water. Gasping for breath, I scrambled to my feet, wincing as pain shot through my legs. I didn't have time to assess the damage. The creature was still coming. I could hear it now, closer than before. Its snarling breaths, the sickening sound of its claws digging into the earth. I aimed my flashlight back up the slope, but all I could see was darkness, a void that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The tunnel ahead was narrow, the ceiling low enough that I had to crouch as I moved. Every step felt like I was being funneled into something worse. The air grew heavier, thicker, the metallic scent from before almost unbearable now. The whispers returned, louder, overlapping, almost frantic. They were all around me, inside my head, and I couldn't block them out. It knows you're here. It will find you. There's no way out. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to drown out the voices, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside me now, crawling beneath my skin, worming their way into my thoughts. I stumbled forward, barely able to focus, and that's when I saw it. A faint light ahead. A way out. I surged forward, my legs burning, every step a struggle against the rising sense of doom. But as I neared the light, I realized something was wrong. It wasn't daylight. It was cold, flickering blue, just like the glow that had surrounded the stone door in the forest. I stopped, my heart pounding. The light was coming from another doorway. Not like the one above, though. This one was larger, carved into the stone itself, its surface covered in the same twisting symbols I'd seen before. And there, standing just beyond the threshold, was a figure. At first, I thought it was the woman from the cavern, but as I drew closer, I saw that it wasn't. This figure was taller, its body draped in tattered, filthy robes, its face obscured by a hood. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, fixed on me. I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. The whispers had grown louder, almost deafening now, but I could barely hear them over the pounding of my heart. Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its presence suffocating. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." I took another step back, the weight of the words hitting me like a physical blow. I didn't know who this figure was, what it wanted, but everything about it screamed danger. I needed to get away. But before I could turn, the creature's growl echoed through the tunnel again, louder, closer. I glanced over my shoulder, and there it was, emerging from the darkness at the far end of the passage. Its massive form blocked the only way out, its eyes gleaming with hunger. I was trapped. The figure in the doorway raised a hand, and suddenly, the symbols on the stone began to glow brighter, pulsing in time with the beating of my heart. The whispers crescendoed, a cacophony of voices screaming in my mind, and I fell to my knees, clutching my head. "It knows. It sees you. Run, before it's too late." But I couldn't run. The creature was too close. I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck, its claws scraping against the stone, and I knew, if I didn't do something, I would die here. Or worse. The figure stepped forward, its hand still raised, and I felt a surge of energy ripple through the air. The creature stopped, snarling, its eyes narrowing as it stared at the hooded figure. For a moment, the two seemed locked in a silent battle, and then, with a deafening roar, the creature turned and bolted back into the darkness. The air in the tunnel grew still, the oppressive weight lifting as the creature disappeared. I collapsed, gasping for breath, the whispers fading to a dull hum in the back of my mind. I glanced up, my vision blurry, and saw the figure standing over me, its face still obscured by the hood. Why did you save me?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The figure lowered its hand, its voice cold and emotionless. "I didn't save you." Before I could respond, the ground beneath me trembled, a low rumble that sent cracks spidering through the stone floor. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging through my body once more. The figure pointed back toward the darkened passage from where the creature had fled. "It's not over," the figure whispered. "It's never over." As if on cue, the deep growl of the creature echoed again, fainter this time, but unmistakably close. It was circling, waiting for the right moment to strike again. I didn't understand what was happening, who this figure was, or what the creature even was, but one thing was clear. I had to keep moving. The hooded figure turned and started walking through the glowing doorway. Without a second thought, I followed, too afraid of what would happen if I stayed behind. The air beyond the threshold was colder, the blue light growing dimmer as we descended deeper into the earth. I wanted to ask more questions, but every time I opened my mouth, the figure's presence seemed to silence me. There was a weight to the air, something heavy and unnatural, as if I was sinking further into something I couldn't comprehend. We walked in silence for what felt like hours, the narrow tunnel winding deeper into the unknown. My footsteps echoed off the stone walls, and every now and then, I would catch a glimpse of the same strange carvings, their twisting patterns shifting when I wasn't looking directly at them. Finally, the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber, larger than anything I had seen before. The ceiling stretched high above, disappearing into the darkness, and at the center of the room was a massive stone structure. A pyramid, ancient and crumbling, its surface covered in more of those glowing symbols. The figure stopped in front of the pyramid and turned to face me. "This is where it ends," the figure said softly. "This is where you make your choice." I blinked, confused. "What do you mean, choice? What is this place?" The figure pulled back its hood, revealing a face that sent a chill down my spine. It was my face, twisted, hollow, with deep, sunken eyes and skin stretched too tight over bone, but unmistakably mine. My heart seized in my chest, and I stumbled back, shaking my head in disbelief. "This is what the mountain does," the figure said in my voice, cold and emotionless. "It takes and it never gives back. You've already seen the beginning. Now you must choose the end." I could barely process what I was hearing, but before I could respond, the ground beneath us trembled again, and the growl of the creature echoed through the chamber, louder now, more desperate. "The door brought you here," the figure said. "But the creature? It hunts for your soul." It stepped back, gesturing toward the pyramid. "Climb, or face the dark." Part 6. The Pyramid of Souls. My legs felt like they were made of lead, but I had no choice. I glanced back at the tunnel I had come from, half expecting the creature to burst through at any moment. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the low rumble of the pyramid vibrating beneath my feet. I had no idea what would happen if I climbed that ancient stone structure, but whatever waited at the top had to be better than the nightmare lurking behind me. The hooded figure, my twisted double, stood at the base of the pyramid, watching me with cold, hollow eyes, its face a mockery of my own. I couldn't understand how it was possible. Was this some version of me? Something the mountain had created, or worse, something I was becoming? I turned my back on it and began to climb. The stones were slick with moss and age, crumbling slightly under my weight as I scrambled up the steep incline. The carvings glowed faintly beneath my hands, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I felt dizzy, lightheaded, as if every step was pulling me deeper into the mountain's grip. The air grew colder as I climbed, each breath burning in my lungs. Behind me, I could hear the creature again, its growls more aggressive, its footsteps closing in. I climbed faster, my hands slipping on the cold stone, my legs burning with exertion. The pyramid felt endless, each step blending into the next, the top always just out of reach. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I pulled myself onto a narrow platform at the very peak. The chamber below looked impossibly far away, the darkness yawning like a black ocean beneath me. I could barely see the ground, but I knew the creature was down there, pacing, waiting for me to make a mistake. At the center of the platform stood a large stone slab, etched with symbols similar to those that lined the walls of the tunnel. But these were different, sharper, more violent, like jagged scars carved into the stone. And then I saw it, what had been waiting for me at the top. A figure lay on the slab. At first, I thought it was another twisted version of myself, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was someone else, someone I recognized. My blood ran cold. It was the old man from the motel. His eyes were closed, his skin pale and lifeless, as if he had been lying there for centuries. His body was thin, emaciated, barely more than a skeleton wrapped in brittle skin. But as I moved closer, his eyes snapped open, milky and distant, locking onto mine. "It's too late," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." I stumbled back, horrified. How was he here? What did this mean? Before I could ask, his body convulsed violently, his back arching off the slab as if he were being pulled by invisible strings. His mouth opened in a silent scream, and the symbols on the stone slab began to glow, brighter and brighter, until the entire platform was bathed in cold, blue light. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling my head, drowning out every other sound. They weren't just voices, they were memories. My memories, snatches of my life, my past, things I had forgotten or pushed aside. They flooded my mind, overwhelming me, tearing at the edges of my sanity. And then, through the haze of whispers and light, I heard the old man's voice again, clearer now. "You're part of it now," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "The mountain never lets go. You belong to it." I shook my head, backing away from the slab. "No," I whispered. "I'm getting out of here." But as the words left my mouth, the blue light intensified, and I felt a searing pain shoot through my chest. I looked down and saw something horrifying, something that made my blood run cold. The glowing symbols were etched into my skin. They had appeared without warning, burning through my jacket, carving themselves into my flesh. I screamed, clawing at them, but it was no use. The mountain had marked me. I was part of it now. "There's no escape," the old man whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the whispers. "The mountain takes what it wants. And it wants you." And then, with a final, violent convulsion, the old man's body collapsed into dust, scattering across the stone slab like ash. The light dimmed, but the symbols on my skin continued to glow, pulsing with the rhythm of my heartbeat. I staggered to the edge of the platform, my body trembling, my mind reeling. The creature's growl echoed from below, but it no longer terrified me. It was the mountain itself I feared now. I wasn't sure what was worse, facing the creature, or becoming part of whatever dark power had claimed this place. "Choose," the whispers demanded. "Stay or run." But even as I thought about running, I knew deep down that it was already too late. Part 7, The Ritual. My mind raced as I stood at the top of the pyramid, trembling, my body branded with the symbols of the mountain. I could feel the cold blue light pulsing through my veins like poison, its rhythm syncing with the pounding of my heart. The whispers were relentless, pushing me to make a choice, but my head swirled with confusion and fear. I had come here to escape, to find peace on the open road, and now I was trapped in something I couldn't even begin to understand. The creature's growl echoed again, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the chamber, reminding me that time was running out. I glanced down at the dark floor far below and could just make out its grotesque form lurking in the shadows, pacing back and forth, waiting for me to descend. I turned back to the stone slab where the old man had been, his body now reduced to nothing more than a thin layer of dust. The symbols etched into the slab still glowed faintly, like embers in the darkness. I knew that whatever had happened to him, whatever fate the mountain had chosen for him, was now hunting me. There was no way down except back through the tunnel where the creature waited, and yet, something was drawing me to the stone slab, to the symbols. I could feel their pull, a force that was both terrifying and strangely familiar, as if they held the key to everything. I stepped closer, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The air around the slab felt charged, electric, as if the mountain itself was watching, waiting for me to make my move. The whispers grew louder, almost frantic now, and I could hear them more clearly than ever. "The choice is yours. Run, and it will follow. Stay, and you will become one with it." I didn't understand what they meant. How could I stay? How could I become part of the mountain? I reached out, my hand hovering over the stone slab, the symbols beneath my skin glowing brighter as I neared it. The light pulsed, and for a moment, I saw visions. Flashes of people, dozens of them, all marked like me, all trapped in the mountain's grasp. Their faces were twisted in agony, their eyes hollow, their bodies broken by the weight of whatever dark force had claimed them. And then I saw myself. I saw my own face, staring back at me from the shadows, twisted and wrong, just like the hooded figure from before. I was becoming one of them. I pulled my hand back, shaking, gasping for breath. No, I couldn't let this happen. I had to escape, had to find a way out before the mountain consumed me completely. But every part of me felt weighed down, as if the mountain itself was pressing against me, holding me in place. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the slick stone as I descended the pyramid, my heart racing in my chest. The whispers screamed in protest, but I pushed them aside, forcing myself to move faster, to escape their grip. I didn't care about the creature anymore. I would rather face it than surrender to whatever nightmare the mountain had planned for me. But as I reached the bottom of the pyramid, the growl came again. Louder this time, more intense. The creature was waiting for me. I paused, breathless, my flashlight flickering in the darkness as I searched for it. The chamber was vast, the shadows deep, but I could feel its presence, lurking just out of sight. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sound of claws scraping against stone filled the silence. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting from one corner of the chamber to the next. The tunnel I had come through was close, just a few steps away, but the creature was between me and my only escape. I could feel its gaze on me, feel the weight of its hunger. It was waiting for me to make a move. I glanced at the stone slab, the symbols glowing softly in the distance. They were calling to me, pulling at the edges of my mind, and I realized then what the whispers had been trying to tell me all along. There was no escape. The creature wasn't the real threat. The mountain was. It had marked me, claimed me, and no matter where I ran, no matter how far I tried to go, it would always be with me. There was no running from this place, no outrunning the force that had pulled me in. Stay, and become one with it. The words echoed in my mind, and I turned slowly back toward the pyramid. The thought of climbing it again, of surrendering to whatever lay at the top, filled me with dread, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was the only way. The creature would tear me apart if I tried to flee, but if I stayed, if I accepted the mountain's call, maybe I would survive. Maybe I would become something else. The growl came again, this time closer, and I knew the creature was preparing to strike. I had no time left. My body ached, my mind reeled, but I forced myself to turn back toward the pyramid, my legs trembling as I began to climb once more. Each step was heavier than the last, the weight of the mountain pressing down on me. The pain in my chest subsided, replaced by a cold numbness that spread through my body. I blinked, disoriented, and realized the light around me had dimmed. The pulsing blue glow from the symbols was now steady, but something had changed. I no longer felt like myself, like I was separate from the mountain. I was connected to it, tethered by something far deeper than I could comprehend. The air was heavy, and for a brief moment, everything was still. The whispers had stopped, but their absence was even more terrifying. It was as if they were watching me now, waiting for me to realize what I had done. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see the symbols still glowing on my skin, but they had faded. Instead, the marks were now part of me, like scars burned into my flesh. I ran my fingers over them, shivering at the cold sensation that lingered beneath the surface. A deep rumble vibrated through the ground, and I stumbled back, catching myself against the edge of the slab. The chamber below was dark, but I could hear movement, something shifting in the shadows. The creature was still there, lurking at the base of the pyramid, waiting for me. But it wasn't the same. I could feel it now, feel the creature's presence as if it were a part of me, like we were connected by the same invisible thread. It wasn't hunting me anymore. It was guarding me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. "You belong to the mountain," I whispered, my voice trembling as the truth settled over me like a shroud. The markings on my skin, the visions, the whispers, they weren't just warnings. They were a bond, a seal. I wasn't leaving this place. The mountain had claimed me, just like it had claimed the others before me. The creature below wasn't a threat anymore. It was part of the mountain's curse, a guardian of whatever twisted force ruled these ancient stones. I turned and looked down at the darkened chamber, the vast expanse of the pyramid and the shadows beyond. I knew, deep down, that there was no escaping this fate. The mountain had chosen me. I was no longer just a man on a motorcycle, riding through Mexico in search of peace. I was something else now. I was part of the mountain's legacy. I backed away from the slab, my hands trembling, and as I did, I heard the growl of the creature one last time, low and guttural, but no longer filled with rage. It was almost protective. I stepped to the edge of the pyramid and looked down, and for the first time, I saw its eyes gleaming in the dark, watching me from below. It was waiting for my command. I was no longer prey. I had become something far worse. The mountain had given me a choice, and now I had made it. Part 8: The Marking. Each step was heavier than the last, the weight of the mountain pressing down on me, seeping into my bones. The creature's growl echoed in the chamber below, but I forced myself to keep moving, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The symbols on my skin burned hotter now, pulsing in rhythm with the light emanating from the pyramid. I could feel the mountain's presence growing stronger, wrapping itself around me, tightening its grip. As I reached the top of the pyramid once more, the stone slab came into view, glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers returned, but they were different now, softer, almost coaxing, as if the mountain was trying to soothe me, to lull me into submission. "You belong here. You are one of us now." I stumbled toward the slab, my mind clouded with confusion and dread. The markings on my skin seemed to tug at me, urging me closer. My hands shook as I reached out, hovering over the glowing symbols. I knew I was crossing a line, a point of no return, but the pull was too strong. I couldn't resist it any longer. As my fingers brushed against the cold stone, the entire pyramid seemed to hum with energy. The blue light flared, blinding me for a moment, and the whispers surged into a deafening roar. I felt something deep within the mountain shift, like a living thing waking from a long slumber. The ground beneath me trembled, and I could sense the presence of hundreds, no thousands of souls, all trapped within the mountain, their voices blending into one. My vision blurred as a searing pain shot through my chest. I looked down, gasping, and saw the symbols etched into my skin glowing brighter, as if they were alive, as if they were burning into me, consuming me. The pain was unbearable, but I couldn't move, couldn't tear myself away from the slab. The mountain was claiming me. Images flooded my mind. Flashes of people, long dead, their faces twisted in terror as they fell into the mountain's grip. I saw riders like me, who had ventured into these mountains seeking freedom, only to be pulled into the mountain's dark embrace. Their souls were now part of it, trapped for eternity, and I realized with horror that I was becoming one of them. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body convulsed, the symbols tightening like chains around my limbs, pulling me closer to the stone. My vision darkened, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. But then the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening. The pain in my chest subsided. I stood at the top of the pyramid, my heart heavy with the weight of the decision I had made. The whispers had returned, but they no longer felt distant. They were inside me now, a constant presence, soft and insistent, murmuring secrets I couldn't quite grasp. The mountain had claimed me, bound me to its ancient will, and though I didn't fully understand it, I could feel the change deep within me. The creature's eyes glowed faintly in the shadows below, waiting. I wasn't sure what it was waiting for, but there was no mistaking the connection between us. I could feel it, an invisible thread linking us, tethering me to this place, to the mountain's power. My instincts told me that it would obey me now. I could sense its movements, feel its hunger, its need to serve. I stepped down from the stone slab, my mind racing with questions, none of which had answers. What was I now? What had I become? And more importantly, what was the mountain's purpose for me? There had to be a reason I was brought here, something beyond just survival. As I descended the pyramid, each step felt heavier than the last. The chamber's vast darkness seemed to close in on me, the air thick with an oppressive stillness. The creature was just out of sight, but I could feel its presence growing stronger as I neared the bottom. My thoughts raced, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. The moment my boots hit the stone floor, the creature emerged from the shadows. Its hunched form slinked toward me, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural light, but it didn't attack. It circled me, moving cautiously, as if waiting for a command, and then it crouched low, its massive head bowed in submission. I stared at it, my pulse quickening. Was this what the mountain had intended? Was this creature now mine? Tentatively, I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched the creature's rough fur. It didn't flinch, didn't growl. It simply remained still, its breathing slow and steady, waiting for my next move. I felt a strange sense of power, a dark thrill that sent shivers down my spine. The creature, the very thing that had terrified me not long ago, was now under my control. The thought should have scared me, but it didn't. Instead, it filled me with a cold, calculating calm. "Guide me," I whispered, my voice barely audible, but I knew the creature could hear me. "Show me the way out." The creature raised its head, its glowing eyes locking onto mine, and without hesitation, it turned and began to move toward the far side of the chamber. I followed, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation. The whispers in my mind swirled, growing more coherent now, and I could almost make out words, fragments of thoughts that weren't my own. The creature led me through a narrow tunnel, its massive body moving with surprising grace despite its size. The walls of the tunnel were covered in more of the strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dark. I couldn't help but wonder what they meant, what they represented. Were they warnings or instructions? As we walked, the air grew colder, the darkness more oppressive, but the creature moved with purpose. It knew where it was going, and somehow I knew it too. This was the path I was meant to follow, the path the mountain had set for me. After what felt like hours of walking, the tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller than the last but just as ominous. At the center of the room was a stone altar, similar to the one at the top of the pyramid, but smaller and more intricately carved. The symbols on the altar glowed brighter, pulsing with a strange, otherworldly energy. The creature stopped in front of the altar, its head lowered once again, as if waiting for me to take the next step. I approached the altar cautiously, my hands trembling as I ran my fingers over the carvings. The whispers grew louder in my mind, and I could feel the power of the mountain surging through me. This place, it wasn't just a tomb or a prison. It was a gateway, a portal to something far older and more dangerous than I could have imagined. And I was the key. I placed my hands on the altar, and the moment my skin touched the stone, a surge of energy shot through me, so powerful it nearly knocked me off my feet. The chamber trembled, the walls vibrating with a low, ominous hum. The symbols on the altar glowed brighter, illuminating the entire room with a cold, blue light. The creature let out a low growl, but it wasn't a sound of anger or aggression. It was reverence. I could feel the mountain's presence more intensely now, like it was alive, pulsing beneath the surface. The whispers became clearer, and I could finally understand what they were saying. "You are the vessel, the one who will carry the mountain's will." I staggered back, my mind reeling from the revelation. A vessel? The mountain had chosen me for something far beyond what I had anticipated. I wasn't just another victim, another soul lost to the dark. I was meant to serve a purpose. But what purpose? What was I supposed to do? As if in answer, the stone beneath the altar shifted, and a deep, grinding sound echoed through the chamber. I watched in horror as a dark, yawning chasm opened at the base of the altar, the blue light from the symbols casting eerie shadows across the floor. The whispers surged again, and I understood. "Enter the abyss, and claim your place." My heart pounded in my chest, fear clawing at the edges of my mind. The creature watched me silently, its eyes glowing with anticipation. The choice was mine to make. I had come too far to turn back now. With one final breath, I stepped toward the chasm, the cold air from below swirling around me like a frozen wind. The darkness beckoned, and I knew that whatever lay beyond that abyss, it was my fate. The mountain had chosen me, and there was no escaping its will. I took one step into the dark, then another, and as I descended into the black void, the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, filling my mind with ancient secrets and promises of power beyond comprehension. The mountain had claimed me. Part 9, Into the Abyss. The descent into the chasm felt endless. The cold air swirled around me like invisible hands, pulling me deeper into the darkness. My breath echoed in the narrow passage, the sound swallowed by the oppressive black void beneath me. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, no longer just faint voices at the edge of my mind. They were a storm inside my head, overlapping, twisting, urging me forward. Every step I took felt heavier, like the mountain was sinking its claws into me, rooting me to its dark purpose. My heart pounded, and I could feel the cold symbols still burning beneath my skin, marking me as one of its own. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. I was no longer just a traveler passing through. The mountain had taken me, claimed me, and whatever awaited below, I was walking straight into its grasp. The creature followed silently behind me, its presence a constant reminder of the mountain's power. It was no longer the thing I feared most. It was something else entirely now. A guardian, a companion. Its breath, steady and measured, was the only sound in the deafening quiet, aside from the steady pounding of my pulse. The path leveled out, and I found myself standing at the edge of a massive underground chamber, so large that the far walls were lost in the shadows. In the center of the room, there was something glowing, a massive stone structure, much like the pyramid I had climbed before, but more ominous, its surface crawling with ancient, unreadable symbols. It wasn't just an altar this time. It was something much darker. At the base of the structure stood a series of twisted statues, their forms barely recognizable as human. They were hunched and broken, their faces contorted in agony, and as I stepped closer, I saw that they weren't made of stone. They were made of flesh, their bodies frozen in a state of eternal torment. The mountain had taken them, just as it had taken me. And yet they still lived. I could see their chests rising and falling, hear the faint rasp of their breaths, trapped in a never-ending cycle of suffering. My stomach churned at the sight. These were the souls who had come before me, the others who had been lured here, marked, and twisted into something unrecognizable. I was walking among the remains of those who had once been just like me, those who had come to this place seeking something, only to be swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't stop myself from walking closer. The symbols on my skin pulsed in time with the glow from the structure, pulling me in, drawing me toward the center of the chamber. The whispers grew louder, and I could hear them more clearly now. They weren't just voices, they were commands. You will become one with the mountain. I stepped forward, my eyes locked on the structure. The statues seemed to shift in the dim light, their faces twisting as if they were trying to warn me, trying to scream. But no sound escaped their lips, only the whispers. I reached the base of the structure and looked up, the cold light casting deep shadows over my face. My hands trembled as I ran them over the surface of the stone, feeling the deep grooves of the carvings beneath my fingers. The energy that radiated from it was overwhelming, almost suffocating, and I could feel it pulling me deeper, sinking its hooks into my mind. You will serve the mountain. The words echoed in my skull, and I knew there was no turning back. This was what I had been brought here for. The mountain didn't just want me, needed me. It had marked me for something far beyond what I could comprehend. The creature moved beside me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, and I felt its silent approval. It wasn't just a guardian. It was a witness, watching as I was drawn into the heart of the mountain's power. And then I heard it. A sound soft at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was a heartbeat, deep, rhythmic, pulsing from the very stone itself. It matched the beat of the symbols beneath my skin, syncing with my own heart, until I couldn't tell where the sound ended and I began. I placed my hand on the stone, and a surge of energy shot through me, filling me with a cold, ancient power that made my skin crawl. The whispers reached a crescendo, and I could feel the mountains were wrapping around me like a vice. Become one with us. My vision blurred, and I felt my body go numb, my mind slipping into the void. I wasn't myself anymore. I was part of something larger, something older than time itself. The mountain was alive, and I was becoming its vessel, its instrument. I tried to pull away, tried to fight it, but it was too late. The mountain had taken me, and then, in the darkness, I saw it. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing at the far end of the chamber. Its form was indistinct, shifting in the flickering light, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and calculating. It stepped forward, and with each step, the ground beneath me trembled, the heartbeat growing louder. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure came closer, and as it did, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't just any figure. It was me, or rather, it was the version of me that the mountain had created, the twisted, hollow reflection I had seen before. Its eyes were empty, its face expressionless, and it stared at me with a cold, mocking gaze. "This is what you are now," it said, its voice flat, emotionless. "You have become one with the mountain." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised its hand, and I felt the air around me tighten, the mountain's grip closing in. There is no escape. I looked into its eyes, my own eyes, and felt the truth settle over me like a shroud. The mountain had taken my soul. Part 10: The Reflection. The figure, my reflection, stood before me, its cold, dead eyes locking onto mine. Every breath I took felt shallow, labored, as if the air itself had grown too thick to inhale. The heartbeat, that slow, rhythmic pounding, filled the chamber, merging with the whispers that never left my mind. My skin tingled with the energy of the mountain, the symbols etched into me pulsing with every beat. I wanted to look away, to break free from its gaze, but I couldn't. My reflection moved closer, its steps deliberate, its face devoid of emotion. It wasn't just a twisted version of me. It was what I had become, a vessel, an extension of the mountain's will. As it neared, I could feel its presence pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. It stopped just inches from me, and I could see my own reflection in its hollow eyes. My heart raced, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. How had this happened? How had I let the mountain take me, twist me into something so far from human? "You've always belonged to the mountain," the reflection said in my voice, but there was no warmth to it, only cold finality. "You've been running your entire life, but now there's no more running." I shook my head, my voice barely a whisper. "No, this isn't me. I'm not this." The reflection smiled, a slow, mocking smile that sent a chill down my spine. "Aren't you? Look at yourself. Look at what you've become." It reached out, and as its hand touched my chest, I felt a surge of cold spread through me, freezing me in place. I gasped, trying to pull away, but my body refused to move. I was trapped, frozen by my own reflection, as the symbols on my skin flared to life, glowing brighter than ever before. I felt the mountain's presence more intensely now, sinking deeper into my bones, filling my mind with its ancient power. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, swirling around me like a storm. "You are part of us now. You will carry the mountain's will." I struggled to fight it, but my strength was fading. I could feel myself slipping away, losing what little of me remained. The reflection's cold hand pressed harder against my chest, and I felt my heart slow, the rhythm syncing with the mountain's heartbeat. "No, no, this can't be," I choked out, my voice trembling with fear. But even as I said the words, I knew the truth. I was no longer just a man lost in the mountains. I was something else, something darker. The reflection leaned in closer, its voice a whisper in my ear. "You are the mountain now." And then, with a sudden burst of energy, I was thrown backward. I hit the ground hard. The air knocked from my lungs, and I gasped for breath. The glow of the symbols faded, leaving only the dim light of the stone structure above me. The heartbeat slowed, the whispers quieting to a dull murmur in the back of my mind. I scrambled to my feet, my entire body shaking. The reflection was gone. The creature that had led me through the tunnels had vanished into the shadows. But I wasn't alone. I could still feel the mountain inside me, its presence a constant, pulsing force. I looked down at my hands, half expecting to see the symbols glowing again. But they had disappeared, leaving only faint scars behind. The marks were still there, beneath the surface, waiting to rise again. I turned toward the stone structure at the center of the chamber, its dark, ancient energy still radiating from its core. The path I had taken, the choices I had made, they all led here. This was my fate. I was bound to the mountain now, just like the others who had come before me. But unlike them, I hadn't been consumed. Yet, I stumbled away from the altar, my heart pounding, and made my way toward the far end of the chamber, where another tunnel stretched into the darkness. The path ahead was uncertain, but I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. If I stayed, the mountain would take me completely, and there would be no coming back. The tunnel was narrow, the walls damp and slick, but I moved quickly, my footsteps echoing through the passage. The whispers had quieted, but I could still feel them, waiting, watching, just beneath the surface of my mind. I had to get out. I had to find a way back to the surface, back to the world I had left behind. But the deeper I went, the more I realized the truth. There was no going back. I wasn't the same person who had entered this place. The mountain had changed me, and no matter how far I ran, I would always carry it with me. I was marked, bound to its will. The whispers would follow me. The heartbeat would always be there, reminding me that I belonged to something far older, far darker than I could ever comprehend. And then, after what felt like hours of walking, I saw it, faint light, flickering in the distance. I quickened my pace, my heart racing with a mixture of hope and fear. The tunnel widened, the ceiling rising above me, and I emerged into a narrow canyon, the sky above a deep, endless black. I had made it out, but as I stood there, staring up at the sky, I felt no relief, no sense of escape. The mountain was still with me. I could feel it in the earth beneath my feet, in the air around me. It was part of me now, forever. I turned and looked back at the tunnel, the dark entrance looming like a doorway to another world. The whispers were silent for now, but I knew they would return. They always did. With one last look at the mountain behind me, I started walking. I didn't know where I was going, but it didn't matter. The road ahead was uncertain, and the mountain's shadow stretched long across the horizon. I was free, but I wasn't alone. Part 11. The Weight of the Mountain. As I walked away from the canyon, the cold night air pressing against my skin, I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead. The sky above was black, endless, like a vast void waiting to swallow me whole. The path I was on seemed to stretch into nothingness, twisting and disappearing into the shadows. My legs felt heavy, each step more difficult than the last, as if I were dragging the mountain's weight with me. The whispers were still gone, but I could sense them lingering at the edge of my mind, waiting for the right moment to return. I kept moving, unsure of where I was heading but knowing that staying in one place wasn't an option. The creature might have been gone, the reflection of myself vanished, but the mountain wasn't done with me. Not yet. Every now and then, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the entrance to the tunnel behind me, but it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't know if I was still in the same world I had left behind or if the mountain had pulled me into some twisted reflection of reality. Everything felt wrong, as if the very air I breathed carried the essence of the mountain, its cold power still pulsing inside me. The road wound through the canyon, the jagged cliffs on either side looming overhead like silent sentinels. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps and the occasional gust of wind. The light from the stars above was faint, barely enough to see by, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. After what felt like hours of walking, I spotted something in the distance. A faint glow, barely visible through the haze of night. My heart raced, a flicker of hope sparking in my chest. Maybe there was something ahead. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. I quickened my pace, the light growing brighter as I drew closer. It flickered, like a campfire, casting long, shifting shadows across the rocky landscape. As I neared, I could see the faint outline of a small village nestled at the base of the canyon, its buildings worn and crumbling, as if they had been abandoned long ago. But the lights were still on. I approached cautiously, my senses on high alert. The village was eerily quiet, the only sound the crackling of the small fire burning in the center of the main square. The buildings were made of old stone, their roofs sagging, the windows broken. There were no signs of life, no movement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stopped at the edge of the square, my breath visible in the cold night air. The fire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows across the ground. For a moment, I considered turning back, leaving this strange place behind and continuing down the road. But something held me there, something pulling me toward the fire. As I stepped closer, I noticed something odd. There were no footprints in the dirt, no signs that anyone had tended to the fire recently. And yet, it burned brightly, as if it had just been lit. The closer I got, the more I could feel the heat radiating from the flames, but the warmth didn't comfort me. It felt unnatural, almost wrong. I knelt down beside the fire, staring into the flames. For a moment, I thought I saw something. An image flickering in the firelight, a face, distorted and twisted, staring back at me from within the flames. I blinked, and the face was gone, replaced by the dancing fire. I stood up, my nerves on edge, and that's when I noticed them. Figures, standing just at the edge of the village, barely visible in the shadows. They were motionless, watching me from the darkness, their forms twisted and wrong, just like the statues I had seen in the chamber beneath the mountain. My heart skipped a beat, my breath catching in my throat. They didn't move. They just stood there, staring at me, their faces hidden in the shadows. I stepped back, my hand instinctively reaching for the knife at my belt. I had no idea who or what they were, but the sight of them filled me with a deep primal fear. The whispers had returned, faint but growing louder, swirling in my mind like a distant storm. They are waiting. The figures remained still, silent, their eyes locked on me. I could feel their gaze, cold and piercing, like they were sizing me up, deciding what to do with me. My pulse raced, and for a moment I considered running, just turning and sprinting back the way I had come, away from the fire, away from the village, away from these figures. But I didn't move. Something about them felt familiar, like I had seen them before. They weren't quite human, but they weren't entirely something else either. They were trapped, just like the souls I had seen in the chamber beneath the mountain. Twisted reflections of what they had once been. And I realized with growing horror that they were waiting for me. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I took another step back, my hand tightening around the hilt of my knife. The figures didn't move, but I could feel the pressure building, the tension in the air thickening. You are one of them. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The figures, they weren't just waiting. They were watching, waiting for me to join them, to step into the darkness and become one of the twisted, broken souls that the mountain had claimed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. I wasn't ready to give in. Not yet. I turned, my heart pounding, and started walking away from the village, back toward the path that led out of the canyon. The whispers screamed in protest, but I ignored them. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let the mountain win. As I left the village behind, the figures faded into the shadows, their cold eyes still watching me as I disappeared into the night. But I knew they wouldn't stay behind for long. They were following. Part 12, The Followers. As I hurried away from the village, the cold wind picked up, carrying with it the whispers I had thought I'd left behind. They clung to the air, swirling around me like a haunting melody that I couldn't shake. The figures, the twisted souls I had seen, were still back there, standing in the darkness at the edge of the village. But I knew they wouldn't stay there for long. They would follow. I walked faster, the panic rising in my chest. The road ahead was just a thin strip of gravel winding through the canyon, illuminated only by the faintest traces of starlight. The oppressive weight of the mountain loomed over me, pressing down from every side, suffocating me. I felt it in the earth beneath my feet, in the cold air I breathed, in the shadows that clung to every rock and tree. The deeper I went, the more the path seemed to narrow, the darkness closing in. The canyon walls stretched high above, jagged and foreboding, blocking out the sky. The light from the stars was fading, replaced by an unsettling gloom that made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. It was as if the very night was thickening, becoming something tangible, something alive. Behind me I could hear them, footsteps, soft, almost imperceptible but unmistakable. The figures from the village were following me, their presence like a weight dragging at my mind, pulling me back toward the mountain. I didn't dare turn around, didn't dare look back, but I could feel them, cold, empty shadows moving in the darkness, growing closer with every step. I forced myself to keep moving, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands shaking as the whispers grew louder in my head. They are coming. They will find you. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt heavy, the weight of the mountain still clinging to me, slowing me down. My breaths came in ragged gasps, each one harder to take than the last. The canyon felt like a tomb, the walls closing in, trapping me in the mountain's grasp. The footsteps grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the cold presence of the figures drawing closer. My mind raced, desperate to find a way out, but there was no escape. I was trapped between the mountain and whatever those things were. Souls twisted and broken, just like I would become if I didn't find a way out. I stumbled, catching myself on a jagged rock, my flashlight flickering weakly as I pointed it ahead. The beam barely cut through the thickening darkness, but I saw something up ahead, a structure low and crumbling, barely visible in the distance. It looked like another abandoned building, similar to the ones I'd seen in the village. But this one was different, felt wrong. There was a glow coming from inside, faint but undeniable, like the cold, unnatural light I had seen back at the stone door in the forest. It flickered like a dying flame, casting long, shifting shadows across the gravel path. I had no choice. I had to keep moving forward. The figures were behind me, getting closer with every second, and I couldn't stop. Not now. As I neared the building, the wind grew colder, biting into my skin. The whispers became clearer, more distinct, as if they were coming from the structure itself. They weren't just voices anymore. They were words, words I could finally understand. You were never meant to leave. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer to the building. The walls were crumbling, the roof sagging, but the doorway was wide open, inviting me inside. The glow from within pulsed softly, rhythmic, in time with the whispers. I hesitated, my mind racing. The figures were still behind me, their footsteps now a steady rhythm in the darkness. I could feel their eyes on me, cold and hollow, waiting for me to make a move. I knew if I went inside, I might never come out. But staying out here meant certain death or worse. I stepped through the doorway, my flashlight flickering as I crossed the threshold. The air inside was colder than outside, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The glow was stronger now, radiating from a stone altar in the center of the room, much like the ones I had seen before. The symbols etched into its surface pulsed with an eerie light, illuminating the walls with their unnatural glow. And then I saw it, a figure, hunched and broken, sitting beside the altar. It was one of the twisted souls, the same as the ones following me. But this one was different. It was familiar. Its face, though distorted and sunken, was one I recognized. It was the old man from the motel. His eyes were dull, lifeless, staring into the flickering light as if he didn't see me at all. His hands rested on the stone altar, his fingers tracing the glowing symbols with a slow, mechanical rhythm. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, only the faint echo of the whispers that filled the room. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice shaking. The old man didn't respond. He just kept tracing the symbols, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were in some kind of trance. I could feel the pull of the mountain stronger than ever now, pressing down on me from every side, threatening to drag me into the same fate that had claimed him. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched his shoulder. His skin was ice cold, like touching a corpse, but as soon as I made contact, his head snapped up. His eyes met mine, and for the briefest moment, I saw recognition flash across his face. Then he spoke. His voice was weak, barely a whisper, but the words sent a chill down my spine. "It's too late for me," he rasped, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. "But you still have a chance." I shook my head, confused. A chance for what? What's happening? What does the mountain want? His eyes flickered to the altar, then back to me. "It wants us all. It always has." The footsteps outside the building grew louder, and I knew the others, the twisted souls, were closing in. Time was running out. "You can still escape," the old man whispered, his voice urgent now. "But you have to go now. Don't look back. Don't let it take you." I took a step back, my mind reeling. I wanted to ask him more, to understand what was happening, but there was no time. The figures outside were closing in, their footsteps now just outside the doorway. The old man's eyes met mine one last time, his voice barely more than a breath. "Run." I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted out of the building, the cold wind whipping against my face as I sprinted down the path. The footsteps behind me grew louder, faster, and I could feel the presence of the twisted souls closing in, their cold hands reaching for me, their whispers filling the air around me. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my legs burning with exhaustion. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away, had to outrun the mountain's reach. The canyon walls closed in around me, the darkness growing thicker, but I didn't stop, couldn't. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A light. Part 13. The light ahead. The light flickered in the distance, barely visible through the thick darkness that pressed in from all sides. My lungs burned as I ran, my legs trembling with exhaustion, but the sight of the light gave me a surge of adrenaline. The whispers behind me grew louder, the cold presence of the twisted souls trailing just steps away, their breath icy on the back of my neck. But the light, it was real. A way out. I could feel it. I had to. I pushed myself harder, my body screaming in protest, but the terror kept me moving. The canyon walls seemed to close in tighter as I sprinted forward, the darkness growing thicker, heavier, as if it were trying to swallow me whole. But the light didn't fade. It grew brighter with every step, a beacon cutting through the suffocating gloom. I could hear the footsteps of the figures behind me now, the soft shuffling of their broken forms in pursuit. I dared not look back, but I could feel their cold, hollow eyes fixed on me, their twisted mouths whispering in unison. "You cannot run. You belong to us." The words sent a shiver through my entire body, but I ignored them. I had heard those whispers before, heard the mountain's call, but I wasn't going to let it take me, not like it had taken the others. The light grew closer, and I could finally make out what it was. A small house, weathered and worn but still standing, its windows glowing with a soft, warm light. It seemed out of place in the harsh landscape of the canyon, as if it had been plucked from another world and dropped here, at the edge of the mountain's grasp. My legs felt like they were about to give out, but I pushed myself the final few steps, stumbling toward the house, my hand outstretched. I could hear the twisted souls behind me now, their footsteps quickening, their whispers growing louder, more frantic. They were close, too close. I reached the front door and slammed my hand against it, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the soft glow of a fire burning inside. Without thinking, I stepped inside and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment, everything was silent. I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The warmth of the fire washed over me, and for the first time since I had entered the canyon, I felt a strange sense of calm. The whispers were gone. The cold presence of the twisted souls had faded, and I was alone, safe. At least that's what I thought. I stood slowly, my legs weak beneath me, and looked around. The inside of the house was small, but warm and inviting. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the wooden walls. A small table sat in the center of the room, and on it was a cup of tea, still steaming as if it had just been poured. The house seemed normal, comforting even, but the longer I stood there, the more I realized something was wrong. The air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't place. And then I noticed the smell. Faint, but unmistakable. Damp earth and decay. The same scent that had clung to the mountain's tunnels, to the twisted souls that had pursued me. I stepped toward the fire, my pulse quickening again. The light from the flames danced across the walls, casting long, unnatural shadows that seemed to shift and twist on their own. I glanced down at the table, at the cup of tea that sat there, and for a brief moment, I considered drinking it, desperate for any sense of normalcy. But then, I noticed something strange. There were 2 cups. One was still steaming, fresh and warm. But the other had long since gone cold, its contents blackened and thick, as if it had been sitting there for years. Before I could think, I heard the creak of footsteps behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was no one there. The house was empty, silent. The whispers hadn't returned, but I could feel someone, watching me. My skin prickled, and I took a slow step back, my eyes scanning the room. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, just beyond the flicker of the firelight, a figure stood. It was barely visible, hidden in the shadows, but I could see its outline. A man tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the darkness. His eyes glinted faintly in the firelight, cold and hollow. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I had seen that figure before, the old man from the motel. He stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his face emerging from the shadows. But something was wrong. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, those lifeless, sunken eyes, stared straight through me, empty and cold. He looked even more withered than the last time I had seen him, as if the mountain had drained what little life he had left. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me with those hollow eyes, his expression unreadable. But there was something in the way he looked at me, something that made my blood run cold. And then he pointed, his hand, bony and skeletal, extended toward the door behind me. The door I had just come through. My heart raced, my mind screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, trapped by the weight of his gaze. The door creaked. I turned slowly, my hands trembling, and saw the door begin to open on its own. The warmth of the fire was immediately swallowed by a cold, biting wind that rushed into the room, carrying with it the familiar sound of whispers. The twisted souls had found me. I backed away from the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the old man didn't move. He just stood there, watching, his arms still outstretched, his eyes locked on me. I could hear the footsteps outside, growing louder, closer. The figures were just beyond the doorway now, their cold presence pressing in on me from all sides. My vision blurred, my mind reeling, and the whispers surged, filling the room with their icy, oppressive weight. You cannot run. You cannot hide. You belong to us. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. The fire flickered, its light dimming, and the shadows on the walls seemed to twist and writhe, stretching toward me like claws. The door swung open fully, and I saw them. Figures twisted and broken, standing in the doorway, their eyes hollow, their mouths whispering in unison. Come back to the mountain. The old man stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate, and for the first time he spoke. It's time. Part 14, The Choice. The old man's words hit me like a punch to the gut. It's time. Time for what? To surrender? To become one of them? Another lost soul in the mountain's grip? My legs felt like they were made of stone, and the cold from the open doorway sent icy fingers down my spine. The twisted figures stood just beyond the threshold, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their whispers swirling in the wind. Their bodies were mangled, distorted, as if the mountain had twisted them into something far removed from humanity. They didn't move, but I could feel the pull. The same force that had been dragging me deeper into this nightmare since I first crossed the mountain's path. I looked at the old man again, his skeletal hand still pointing toward the door. His sunken eyes locked onto mine. He wasn't the man I had met at the motel, not anymore. He was a part of this, just as I would be if I let the mountain claim me. I could see the truth in his face. He had made this choice long ago, and now it was my turn. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The fire crackled behind me, the warmth barely holding back the creeping cold of the mountain's influence. My mind raced, searching for a way out, for something, anything, that would break the mountain's hold on me. But no matter how hard I tried to fight it, the truth was clear. I had been marked. Since the moment I crossed into the mountain's domain, it had been drawing me in, twisting me, making me a part of its endless cycle of souls. I could still feel the marks on my skin, the symbols burned into my flesh, glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. The mountain had claimed me, and now it was time to decide. Come back to the mountain, the whispers urged, growing louder, more insistent. The twisted figures in the doorway took a step closer, their movements slow and deliberate, as if they were giving me one final chance to resist. I could feel the weight of the mountain pressing down on me, suffocating me, pulling me back into its grasp. My knees buckled, and for a moment, I almost collapsed under the crushing weight of it all. But then, something inside me stirred. A faint spark, small, but undeniable. It wasn't just fear or desperation. It was defiance. I stood up straighter, my heart pounding in my chest. The old man's hollow gaze followed me, his lips twisting into a frown, as if he could sense the shift in me. The twisted figures in the doorway paused, their whispers faltering for just a moment. I took a step forward, toward the fire, my hands trembling as I turned to face the old man directly. "No," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "I'm not going back. I'm not going to let the mountain take me." The old man's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "You have no choice," he rasped, his voice cold and empty. "You belong to the mountain now. There is no escape." But I shook my head, the defiance inside me growing stronger. "Maybe there is no escape for you," I said, my voice growing louder, stronger. "But I'm not you. I won't let it take me." The old man's face twisted into something dark and malevolent, his sunken eyes gleaming with anger. The twisted figures in the doorway shifted, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their whispers rising once again, louder, more insistent. "You cannot run. You belong to us." But I didn't listen. I turned toward the fire, my mind racing. The fire, something about it was different, important. It was the only thing in this place that felt warm, real. Everything else, the cold, the darkness, the twisted souls, they were all part of the mountain's influence. But the fire was separate. I reached out toward the flames, feeling their heat wash over my skin, driving back the cold, the whispers. The old man snarled behind me, his voice rising in a furious growl. "You can't escape this. You are already one of us." I ignored him. My hand hovered over the flames, and for a brief moment, I hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if this wasn't the answer? But the defiance inside me flared again, stronger than the fear. I couldn't let the mountain win. I couldn't become one of them. I plunged my hand into the fire. The pain was immediate and searing, like nothing I had ever felt before. My skin burned, the flames licking up my arm, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I gritted my teeth and forced myself to keep my hand in the fire, the intense heat overwhelming my senses. My mind screamed for me to stop, to pull away, but something deep inside told me that this was the only way. As my hand burned, I felt something else, something cold and dark loosening its grip on me. The whispers, which had been growing louder and more insistent, faltered. For the first time, the oppressive weight of the mountain seemed to lift, if only for a moment. I glanced back toward the old man, and his twisted, withered face contorted with fury. "No!" he screamed, his voice rising in a desperate, guttural wail. "You cannot escape. The mountain owns you." But I wasn't listening anymore. The fire, the warmth, was pushing back against the mountain's hold. I could feel the symbols burned into my skin fading, their grip on me weakening with every second. The twisted figures in the doorway shifted uneasily, their hollow eyes wide, their whispers growing frantic. I could hear their voices blending together, rising into a deafening chorus of desperate pleas. "Stay with us. Belong to us." I clenched my teeth, ignoring the pain in my hand, and plunged deeper into the fire. The flames seemed to wrap around me, and the heat intensified, but instead of hurting, it began to feel purifying, cleansing. It was as if the fire wasn't just burning away the flesh, but burning away the mountain's corruption as well. The old man staggered forward, his gaunt frame trembling with rage. His eyes, hollow and lifeless, locked onto mine, but he seemed different now, smaller, weaker. He raised a trembling hand, pointing at me, his voice a low hiss. "You can't fight it. The mountain will take you. You will become one of us." I shook my head, feeling a surge of determination unlike anything I had felt before. "I'm not like you. I'm not giving in." The old man's face twisted in anger, and he lunged toward me, his skeletal hand reaching out to grab me. But as he stepped into the light of the fire, something incredible happened. The flames flared, brighter than before, and the old man recoiled, his body trembling as the light seemed to burn him from the inside out. He let out a scream, a shriek of pure agony, as his form began to disintegrate. His pale, withered skin cracked, and the dark energy that had once clung to him like a second skin evaporated into the air. The old man collapsed to the floor, his body crumbling into dust, his screams echoing through the house until there was nothing left but silence. I pulled my hand from the fire, gasping for breath. The pain in my hand had faded, replaced by a strange numbness. I looked down at my skin, expecting to see it charred and burned, but to my surprise, it was whole, untouched by the flames. The symbols that had been etched into my flesh had vanished, their dark power gone. The fire crackled softly behind me, its warmth a comforting presence in the cold, oppressive darkness of the house. I turned to face the doorway, where the twisted figures still lingered, their hollow eyes fixed on me. But something had changed. They were no longer advancing, no longer whispering. Instead, they stood frozen, their bodies flickering like shadows caught in the wind. And then, one by one, they began to disappear. The whispers faded, growing quieter until they were nothing more than faint echoes in the distance. The figures, once terrifying and relentless, dissolved into the darkness, their twisted forms unraveling like smoke caught in the wind. The house, once suffocating with the mountain's presence, felt lighter now, as if the mountain's hold had been broken. I took a deep breath, the air no longer heavy with the scent of decay. The weight on my chest lifted, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I felt free. I stepped out of the house, the cold wind biting at my skin, but it no longer felt oppressive. The canyon stretched out before me, vast and empty, the darkness receding as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. I had survived. I didn't know how much of me had changed, or what the mountain had truly wanted, but I had refused to let it take me. I had fought back, and for now that was enough. With one last glance at the crumbling house behind me, I turned and walked away, the faint warmth of the fire still lingering in my veins. The road stretched out ahead, uncertain and full of shadows, but I no longer felt the mountain's pull. The whispers were gone, and the twisted souls no longer followed. I was free, but deep down, I knew the mountain would always be there, waiting, watching, and though I had escaped its grasp, the scars it left behind would never truly fade. Part 15. The Mountain's Shadow. The road stretched endlessly before me, winding through the canyon like a snake slithering into the unknown. The first light of dawn bathed the horizon in shades of gray and orange, the cold air biting at my skin, but it no longer carried the oppressive weight of the mountain. I was free, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself as I walked away from the nightmare I had just escaped. My legs ached with every step, my body drained from the endless chase, but I kept moving. The whispers were gone, the twisted souls no longer following in the shadows, but the weight of everything I had seen, everything I had survived, still hung heavy in the air. The mountain had let me go, but its presence lingered in my mind, like a shadow that would never truly leave. I could feel it in the back of my thoughts, a faint whisper that reminded me that it was still watching, waiting for the right moment to call me back. But I had escaped. I had refused to become one of them, to surrender to the mountain's will. And that was enough for now. The road narrowed as I neared the edge of the canyon, the towering cliffs looming on either side, casting long shadows across the path. I could see the open desert ahead, a vast expanse of nothingness stretching out for miles, but something about it felt different, less hostile, less threatening. I glanced over my shoulder one last time, back toward the mountain that loomed in the distance, its jagged peak shrouded in mist and darkness. It looked different now, smaller, less imposing. But I knew better than to be fooled. The mountain's power wasn't in its size. It was in its ability to reach into your mind, to twist your soul, to make you a part of its endless cycle of torment. I had seen what it could do. The old man from the motel, the twisted souls that had followed me, the symbols burned into my skin. They were all proof that the mountain's reach went far beyond its physical boundaries. Took what it wanted, and it didn't let go easily. But I had escaped, and that was something. The fire had cleansed me, burned away the mountain's corruption, and given me a second chance. The scars on my skin might have faded, but the memory of what had happened would stay with me forever. As I stepped out of the canyon and into the open desert, the weight on my chest began to lift. The sky above was clear now, the early morning sun breaking through the darkness, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The world was vast, open, full of possibilities, and the mountain, though still present in the distance, no longer had its claws in me. I walked for what felt like hours, the sun rising higher in the sky, warming my skin as I put more distance between myself and the nightmare I had survived. The road was empty, the silence comforting in its normalcy. No whispers, no twisted figures, no oppressive darkness. Just the sound of my footsteps and the wind blowing across the desert. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in me. I wasn't the same person who had ridden into Mexico seeking peace and escape. The mountain had left its mark, not just on my skin but on my soul. I had seen things, felt things that no one should ever experience, and even though I had escaped, a part of me would always belong to that place. I reached the edge of a small town as the sun began to set again, its orange glow casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The town was quiet, almost too quiet, but after everything I had been through, it felt like a refuge. I made my way to a small diner, its neon sign flickering in the fading light, and pushed open the door. The bell above the door jingled, and the waitress behind the counter glanced up, giving me a tired smile. "You look like you've been through hell," she said, pouring a cup of coffee and sliding it toward me. I nodded, offering a weak smile in return. Something like that. I sat down at the counter, the warmth of the coffee seeping into my hands as I stared out the window at the quiet streets. The mountain was far behind me now, a distant memory on the horizon, but its presence still lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow that would never fully disappear. The waitress leaned on the counter, watching me curiously. "Where you coming from?" I hesitated, the memory of the twisted figures and the whispers flashing through my mind. "Just passing through," I said quietly, taking a sip of the coffee. She nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and left me alone. I sat there in silence, the warmth of the diner a stark contrast to the cold, oppressive darkness I had left behind. The sound of normal life around me, dishes clattering, the hum of the jukebox, was soothing, a reminder that I had made it out, that I was free. But as I sat there, staring into the coffee, I couldn't help but feel the faintest whisper at the edge of my consciousness. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was there, lingering in the back of my mind. You will return. The mountain always calls you back. I closed my eyes, shaking my head, refusing to let it pull me in again. I had escaped. I was free. But I knew, deep down, that the mountain's shadow would always be there, waiting. The end.